live. Hello, everyone. We are at day three of the biggest testing conference ever, TestMu, and I hope you are having great day so far. I know I am, and I got to learn a lot from all the sessions we had. To introduce myself, I am Mudit Singh, founding team member at Lambda Test, and I lead the marketing function here, and I would be your host for this session. But joining us today for this session is Dmitry Vinnik. He is an engineering manager specializing in AI/ML and currently working at Meta. But apart from leading the cutting edge engineering team at Meta, he is also a regular speaker at conferences and meetups. And he likes to talk about development, open source, and engineering leadership. Now, the topic today that Dimitri is gonna help us out with is something that is pretty close to my heart. Now, as part of Lambda Test, I got a chance to connect with a lot of big companies, a lot of big enterprises, Microsoft, Google, Meta, you name it. And I got a chance to learn from the testing teams that are at large scale enterprises, and the way they approach towards testing is pretty interesting to know about, pretty interesting to learn. And that's the topic for today as well. So Dimitri will do a deep dive into how testing at scale is done at a big enterprise, at a big tech-based enterprise like Meta. Before we get started, few ground rules. We will gonna take the session questions at the end of the session. You will have the opportunity to ask them in the right side in the QA section. So feel free to add over there. At the end of the session, we'll take those questions. All this session is also recorded and we'll be uploading them over. You can watch them in the view schedule button and watch the replay. And at the end of this week, we'll be uploading them to our YouTube channel as well. So you can check out over there. Now, with that out of the way, please welcome Dimitri. Dimitri, the stage is all yours.
Awesome. Thank you so much for introducing me. I'm excited to be here. So without further ado, let's get started. For the longest time, I used to say, without further ado, apparently it's ado. So let me share my screen now. Let's pick a tab. Okay, I guess that's the one. Good, that should be the one. All righty, because I have several versions of this talk. All right, I think we should be good to go.
Yep, okay. I'm able to see the screen.
Great, and you can see me changing the slides?
Yep, yes, I do.
Fantastic. I'm not sure if people also can see me as why I'm presenting, or is it just the slide deck?
No, they are able to see you as well.
Oh, so good, awesome. Good. So I won't be making funny faces while presenting, okay, and I'll be trying to look into the camera. All right, let's get started then. Thank you for the introduction. Just to quickly go over one more time, I've been working with Meta open source for several years now. And of course, as you might know, Meta also works with a family of apps, and it includes things like Messenger, Facebook, Instagram, WhatsApp, and many more products you might have heard about. But focusing on the talk itself, one thing I'd like to make it clear today is that it doesn't really matter whether you work for a big company or a small company. The same practices and patterns you might be using at a smaller startup would be best applied at a big organization. It's actually the problems that might hide away because you've been dealing with so many things while working at a smaller scale get amplified, like anything, right? When we talk about performance, and if you, let's say you're working with 100 customers, right? And 1% is the error rate you'll be getting, right? It's one person out of 100. But if you scale your organization to now having 1,000, 10,000, like 1 million customers, now that 1% rate is a lot larger, 1% error rate, right? The same goes for testing and focusing on quality. The bigger the company, the bigger kind of the lens, the scope of your work. But if you carry over the best patterns you have used at small organizations, would really get you to thrive at any organization. And that's why I kind of start my talk by saying, there is a common phrase that people use in North America in particular: little kids, little problems, big kids, big problems, right? You think that the kids are small, it's tough, but then they grow up and the problems are on a different scale, the different potential outcome. The same goes for, I sometimes say small companies, small problems, big companies, big problems. And as I just try to describe to you, those kind of things get amplified. The things you might overlook today in a small organization, you most likely will see in a bigger sense at a big organization. So that's really the only difference. And that's, again, what my talk will focus on today. So it all comes down to issues between the teams. That's ultimately what I've seen leads to a poor quality of a product. It's the gap within the teams that work within the organization, whether, again, small or big. And that's where those issues I've mentioned that get amplified are more visible than not. And usually I have certain stakeholders or parties or audiences or personas, whatever you want to call them, that I've identified. There are engineers, there are testers, and there are other stakeholders. It could be project managers, TPMs, the technical product managers, lots of different stakeholders. I like to view them as customer representatives, but you can, plug in any sort of title into the stakeholder section. But basically, if you can think of all these three different personas, the gaps between them, how these folks communicate, is what leads to issues that, as I said before, get amplified at a bigger scale. And our goal today is to bridge that gap. Is to bridge the gap between engineers, testers, and stakeholders. And that's what we'll focus on today. So, and that basically will help you to test at scale. Because testing at scale, it's really about communication. As everything else in life. So today's focus, to be more specific, we'll focus and discuss quality over quantity. We will bring over this union of engineering and testing and highlight the importance of people taking accountability, being responsible for quality, not just some team far away dealing with testing, but in reality, whoever works on the product, each and every person is responsible for the code, for the product, for the end result. And the agenda, as it said, is we'll start with the quality over quantity, then we'll go over focusing on the basics, because that will basically get us working much better on a bigger scale, and focusing on discussing team dynamics in a bit more concrete specifics that will help people take something away from this talk. In general, talks like this, they cover a big vast topics, different areas, and so hopefully at least one of the sections, one of the areas I cover will resonate with you, and you can take away at least something, because everyone will take whatever resonates the most with them out of this presentation. But also, again, very much I'm open to Q&A at the end. This talk is not too long. I'm more focused on the questions at the end. So let's do just that. But again, let's begin with quality over quantity discussion. Okay, so where do we start? It's as always, work is just work. So life is much more important. So let's talk about life. And there is this great book that I, encourage people to read, or at least get familiar with, called Natural Causes, where basically the idea there was that it's not really about quantity of years of life you get, but it's a quality of life that you get. There is this great phrase that very much resonates with me, is that we've added years to life, but not life to years. In some places, it will be focused on trying to prolong person's life, but actually forgetting the quality of that life. And I'm very much for the quality, if anything else. Ideally, you have the both, but if I were to pick, that's what I would go for. And everyone is different, but that's what I personally prefer to enjoy. The same approach is what I take in work, right? Especially in testing. And quality is what I would focus on, especially, as I said, in testing. So what's the problem with quantity, though? With quantity, again, yet another phrase people often use, you can't see trees for the forest for the trees. There is the phrase, right? Basically, what that phrase means is that if you have so many test failures, so many tests, especially what people like to refer to as flaky tests, something you just used to, you have a dashboard where you test results, and some of them just continue to be red, constantly failing. And because you have hundreds and hundreds of those, as I mentioned before, 1% expected test failure rate end up being hundreds and thousands sometimes test failures. And because you have those test failures, you might overlook a real production concern. And that's what this kind of a illustration demonstrates, is when you have a forest of test failures you kind of get used to, you might miss out on that one important test case that would have caught a real production case, a real grievance your customer are facing. So our goal should be, people sometimes call Goldilocks test suite, which means this is basically a fairy tale that's been adapted in many different languages, called many different ways in different countries. But basically, it's the idea that this girl, Goldilocks, went to the house of bears in the forest. There were like 3 different sets of soup or porridge, and she was trying to pick the one that, if she likes the most, like the temperature, the texture, basically just right. And that's what people refer to for Goldilocks test suite. It's just the right number of tests that will cover your core use cases, what you should be thriving for. Not like the 100% code coverage that some companies try to reach, even though it adds more complexity in maintenance costs than anything else. So the conclusion is really, once again, quality trumps over quantity. Quality is more important. So now, with our priorities set straight, that the quality is what we try to go for, how do we improve? How do we go from here? It's all going back to the basics. Everything starts with a great foundation. Try to build fancy new house with a horrible foundation on a swampy grounds. It's not going to work. You have to set a very good foundation, because that's what ultimately will help you scale, even if we talk about scaling testing. So back to the basics. Nothing new there. I'm sure you've seen this before. I'm sure you've seen talks about it. Test pyramid. And the fact that you're supposed to have the highest number of unit tests at the very bottom. They are the lowest cost. They are the fastest to run. They give you the lowest level of confidence in the overall system, or as they say, lowest level of fidelity. Integration is when you have multiple units interacting. Basically, you can think of multiple functions, multiple components working together, and you testing that. A bit fewer of those, because they're more complex. And at the very top of the pyramid, the fewest number of any tests you should have are tests that cover end-to-end a use case that your customer might be going through. They are the most expensive to write, to run, and maintain. They are the slowest, but they give you the highest level of confidence in your overall system. That's the gist of it. That's what the test pyramid is for. It might sound simple, but it's easier said than done. I've never in my life seen test pyramid working, even from day one of a startup. So the real test pyramids are actually something like ice cream cone, hourglass, or cupcake. Very sweet naming, horrible problem to deal with. So let's talk about ice cream cone. Team Cochrane put together this nice diagram, but basically how it works is you actually have the reverse pyramid. You have fewest number of unit tests, you have a lot higher number of service tests or integration tests, and a lot of end-to-end tests. And even more on top, like an icing on a cake, lots of manual tests. The reasons for that, and I'll dive into that in just a moment, are plenty. But the main problem with this approach is that with ice cream cone, you might be prioritizing manual testing, which might not be the problem, but when you prioritize it, it becomes a problem. You have way too many UI tests. As we all know, it's the most expensive ones to run and to maintain. And you have way too few unit tests. Unit tests are a fantastic tool for your developers to get feedback quickly on the work that they do. When they deprioritize this sort of work, the life cycle, the feedback loop gets to be longer. And as a result, you deliver product less frequently. You're fixing bugs. The fixing of the bugs or debugging takes a lot longer. There are many pitfalls to that approach. And of course, UI tests, as we all know, as I said multiple times now, expensive to run and to maintain. It often happens because of miscommunication, or more specifically from the examples I've seen, is when there is a hard divide between the teams, like I deal with the issue, I deal with the bug, I throw it over the fence, like to some other team. Now you're responsible for testing it. I'm not even gonna test it with unit test as a developer. I just throw it to somebody to deal with that and tell me if it works or not. And that's how we ultimately end up here. Sometimes, very often, even if the developers are the ones responsible for UI tests, for end-to-end tests, there is a constant duplication of the effort. If multiple teams, let's say, go through a login workflow, right? Both of those teams end up writing the same test for logging workflow instead of reusing the same, like one component to go through that. And it, of course, adds to the number of tests. And as I said before, and I'd like to make it clear, manual testing is very important. Especially, I like exploratory testing. There's this fantastic book by Elizabeth Hendrickson called Explore It, where they go into the concrete examples of how to use exploratory tests where it's extremely useful. So nothing bad with that. But manual testing cannot be your core testing. It's just not scalable. If every time a developer or a team fixes the bug, they have to run through 100 regression tests, and 100 is a very small number to even code. It's just you have to have a staff over hundreds of testers just dedicated to that. It won't be sufficient. So, because ultimately these days continuous delivery, continuous integration became a must-have. It's not a discussion whether you should have it or not. You have to have that. You definitely do. And so, testing, as you can see from this small diagram, plays a major role on two levels: early on, after the build, and later on, after the deploy. Basically, you can see testing, it appears twice. Nothing else appears twice here on this pipeline. You don't see development twice on this diagram. Testing is not any less important. It's more important, one would argue, than the development itself. In the early on process, right, you can call it like a smoke test, making sure you don't break the app. And later on in the test, more big organizations, they would usually trigger like a separate set of test cases to have a full coverage, like a regression suite, which might be thousands of tests on different environments. But early on, you would have like a very small subset, what people would call smoke tests or health checks to make sure your fix doesn't bring down the entire application, right? So the app is loaded, the executables are still buildable, things of that nature. So testing, continuous delivery, extremely important. And as I said before, smoke tests early on and regression funnel, regression test suites are later on. UI tests, of course, as I said, expensive. Having too many of them, it might give you high confidence level, but again, dealing with them, you will spend more time with fixing tests than fixing the development code, the production code that the tests were built to help you work with. They're slow and they're costly. So why do we end up so many? As said before, you have test duplication because the teams don't talk to each other or might be going through the same workflow, just duplicate the effort. And that, let's say, some other team changes the logging selector, from username to be users-name. Now every team has to update their logging workflow. That's a nightmare, but that's a real situation people go through. People sometimes think that it's just much easier to hire a team of testers to write these UI tests instead of developers spending their precious time writing these tests. It's a horrible approach to investing development cycles in. It's very important to prioritize planning for testing from early on in the stage of developing the product. The sunk cost fallacy, which basically means, we're already down this path. We have lots of Selenium tests, automation built for our product. Let's just keep doing it. Because people are afraid of, they already spent so much that now reinvesting into something else, focusing on UI tests, on unit tests, re-educating developers in writing integration tests doesn't worth it. And so they just keep going with more and more UI tests. And the fact that they think that decomposition fallacy, basically, they think, if we test the full system, right, going through login, going to the navigation menu, picking like accounts. If we test the full scope, the whole system, we tested the individual components, but that's definitely not true. Ultimately, with priority fallacies, as I said before, it's about this ball throwing, right? My development team done, testers do your thing. But again, it's not a good approach to take. There is just no accountability anymore. Developers think that testing the quality is someone else's problem, and that should never be something people think. And again, the fact that regressions is just a future problem. Let's deal with something now. We have a tight deadlines. Let's fix it. Quality will come next. So one thing I want to bring to people's attention, whether it's developers or testers, testing is everyone's responsibility, not a single person, not a single team. So again, solution for this problem, we need to make sure we recognize the issue. People, especially managers or higher ups, they like numbers. It might be, if you try to show them the test pyramid, it will just be too much context, additional context that's unnecessary. So instead, try to measure how much time developers, let's say you don't separate developers and testers. So try to measure how much time you spend on going through the tests that constantly fail, how much time you spend fixing them, maintaining them, over potentially writing new unit tests and integration tests. People understand numbers. Have a proper handoff standards. What I've seen teams do is developers do not let QA team work on a story, on a ticket, on a work item, unless the developer shipped both development code and a set of unit tests and integration tests. QA team would only tackle UI tests. So in that case, there is already core use cases covered with this kind of the core simplest use cases covered with developers. Developers know that actually it does work, so there is no back and forth anymore. And the QA only focuses on like a very core main use cases that the customer would go through. So really treating test code same way as production code. It's basically, you need to make sure the test code is reviewed. So developers are a part of a review for the testing code, for the test automations. So they don't just, the quality of the code itself is on the same level, because whether it is of the same level or not, at least developers don't think it's less than production code and vice versa. So you enforce the same patterns, the same coding styles. So one, developers can read testing code and vice versa. Sometimes it's good to have a dedicated test champion. It's basically a member of the team who always is reviewing the test code and vice versa. One-to-one model, as I said before, if you have a story, at least there is one unit test or one integration test that goes along with it. And if you know of specific, especially difficult areas or core areas, like, as I said, login, for example, make sure those are reviewed with extra caution, because you might regress multiple teams. This is a great book to just go by, The Pragmatic Programmer by Andrew Hunt and David Thomas. That covers a variety of things, including some of the principles I usually guide myself when working with testing. And unit tests, as I said before, they're important because they give the feedback to the team, especially developers, early on. But why does the feedback matter? This kind of a small diagram by Jeff Atwood. Where does developers spend most of their time? It's actually understanding their code. They'll forget really quickly what that code was. And the unit tests, if anything else, is just a great way to document what you meant, what you were building it for. It's how you document some of the acceptance criteria you have as a developer. Because documentation gets outdated. A code, if the test is failing, you would see it right away. So the bridging this gap between engineers and testers, it's not just about unit tests. It's about this whole taking responsibility for the testing for both developers and testers. And getting more feedback. This is what the tests are for. And testing for the feedback loop, again, the developers and testers can work together in writing them. If anything, I've seen some organizations when they go through this transition period, where there used to be a separation of one team is developer team, one team is a QA team, and instead you have what's called hybrid. So everyone is just a single team. So everyone is a software engineer, and that developer, that engineer would be responsible for both development and testing. And with this transition, usually the biggest concern that will end up being highlighted is developers might not have, or just might be taking for granted, the testing expertise that the testers have. And so it's important for testers, QA engineers, bring over this expertise in software quality, in identifying core use cases, not just covering like everything under the sun, but help developers understand what to write when it comes to tests, help to understand where to focus, and ultimately what to change, right? How to drive towards this better test pyramid that we all wish we had. Unit tests are fantastic for writing. Understanding integration tests are great for, because they get multiple components working together. And with the change, it's really, we can see how the whole workflow works end to end. That's basically what 𝐂𝐸𝐭𝐫 highlighted. Hourglass is very similar. You might have a great number of unit tests, lots of UI tests, but very few integration tests. This is like an extreme version of two teams not talking to each other. Developers doing unit tests, QA doing UI tests, and no one actually doing things in between. The problem there is communication, as I said. Cupcake, very similar. Fabio Pereira put this diagram together. Too many manual tests still, quite a few automated UI tests, and lots of integration and fewer integration and the unit tests. Still, it's an inverted test pyramid. The same problem, miscommunication. Communication is basically the issue that becomes more of an issue at scale. So what's the pattern, as I said before? Communication. That brings us to the main and the last topic I want to bring up is the team dynamics. So when it comes to working with people, it's important to be aligned on the goals, why you're doing what you're doing. Try to go down this direction of the test pyramid, bring that over. Try to speak the same language in code, meaning when you have a meeting between testers and developers, you do not want to, or even PMs, project managers, whoever else, you don't want to waste time in explaining what each word means. Like, let's say in developer code, you call something an account, right? But on the test side of things, you call accounts users. In the code, like accounts.java and dev, in testing side, you call it test user.java. Instead of, you should have called it test account.java, or vice versa. It should have been user.java and test user.java. But anyways, the fact that now you have to have this mental gymnastics of, okay, an account, or mental mapping. Account means user, user means an account, but then let's bring in a third person like PM who doesn't know what account or user is, have to tell them it's the same thing, have to have this additional conversation. That's too much. It gets out of hand really quickly. So speak the same language in the sense of the code, so you can read each other's code well. Hybrid teams, again, is another way people try to deal with the communication where there is no separation, testers and developers, everyone's doing the same thing. There is a great case study for that from the book Outliers. Basically, in South Korea, in between like 1980 and 1990, there was an issue with quite a few incidents that had been happening on board of airplanes, and the main issue was this from how the book outlined it, was because people spoke Korean, and even though the crew of the airplane, attendants and maybe co-pilots, saw some issues happening, they weren't able to question captain and bring up this issue to this person's attention, to the captain's attention, because it might have appeared disrespectful because of the language they used, the language they spoke, the cultural norms. And so what they did, after several incidents had been happening, they transferred the entire, airspace in the South Korea to use English only. And as a result, the number of incidents went down significantly, like almost to basically zero, because in English it's fairly straightforward, the way we speak, the way we communicate. and they were able to bring up issues without concern over offending a captain, for example, by bringing up that something actually unrelated to the captain's work came up, right? There's like a spot on the window, or a window is cracking, or whatever else. I watch way too many horror movies to start quoting those examples. So team understanding is also important, is to have clear understanding between testing and production, whether it's environment or the code has to be as similar as possible. Team ownership has to be accounted for. Everyone should feel sense of ownership over their code, both test code and development code. Have a single united team. Talk the same language when you discuss, like, as I said, accounts and users, things of that nature. But still, keep your eye on the customer. Who are you doing it for? It's really not about having a code that functional or test coverage that 100%. It's about the customer experience. Sometimes a bug is a feature because the customer thinks it is. So think of a customer first. So my call to action here is welcome the change, right? If you have issues today, maybe try to change it, experiment. What I like about Agile more than anything else, not thousands of books people wrote or certifications that are out there, but more the fact that they iterate, they try to experiment, they don't try to commit to a thing for a year. They just, let's give it a try and see how it works. So welcome this sort of change, respect the basics for your team, and try to implement them if you haven't yet. Lead by example. What I liked about React as the way to build UI, and I'm not saying it just because of working with Facebook and Meta, is because you were able to build like an empire within any app almost, right? You could build like a small component first and then expand it. So lead by example. Show that, try to understand another person, another party, and bridge that gap by yourself. And communicate. Talk to people. Over communication is usually a better approach than not. So with that, we'll go to the Q&A. And by the way, you can always contact me in a bunch of places. Just email me if anything else. It's at the bottom. That's probably the better approach. But yeah, that's all for my slides. So let's go into the Q&A if you have any.
First of all, thanks for the session, Dmitry. It was really insightful. I now have 4 books that I have to read. I have now a reading homework. We discussed 4 cool books. I was just searching about them. Pretty good. So, okay, let's start with, I kind of sorted the questions here by the number of upvotes, maybe by popularity. The first question that I have, maybe I will show it on the stage and you can help us out with this.
Okay, let's see. Could you provide an example of how Meta's testing approach adapts to different project needs while maintaining consistent quality standards? There are several ways, and it's not just Meta. All the big organizations I've seen operate the same way. But basically, it starts with, it starts early. They have a boot camp, as I would call it. So when you, regardless of the team you join, whether it's an official boot camp and you have actually, like we used to have at Meta, for example, weeks in like 6 weeks or so, where you would go to classes, lectures, workshops and things like that, where you learn the products, you learn the tools, you learn how to use like Rust and things like that, the Swift, Objective-C, and what exactly we use. You import code style into your IDE that the team uses. So the big organizations also have to juggle the problem, you can call it a problem, of freedom, where teams generally were allowed at least, and we'll see how it continues, but to pick their own tool if it fits and solves the problem. That being said, within the same organization, within the same team, you would have a set of code styles. Like let's say if you're working with Java, you have the Java code style, which I work in previous organizations would like use Google coding style as a baseline. You import it, so your simple things like indentations and things like that, the code itself looks the same. That's very general overview. Boot camps and like onboarding procedure, where they will focus. They would say, this is how we test things. This is how our code base looks like. This is what the UML or like architecture looks like. That's where you begin with those basics to understand things. And really, it's just by trying out things. They don't really enforce a specific way, but they have expectations of you. I don't know if I answered your question. I don't want to go into that too much, but if you have follow-up questions, please do ping me. Reach out to me separately, or we can dive into that too if Q&A allows it. I can go into more examples, but yeah, it's basically onboarding becomes the key, and knowing the code base and architecture of your test. Like, you wouldn't create a brand new test base class for testing something. You would already have one, and so you would get to that by examining existing code, by being a code reviewer, by reading this documentation, by reading the code, and that's how you get there. So you're not going to just start doing your own thing from the get-go.
Awesome. Another question I have, I think this is something that you mentioned about, that people have to, at a large scale company like Meta, you have to ensure that, let's say, at scale, the performance that you're providing to your end users is important. So how do you take care about those edge devices that people are using to, let's say, access Meta or products from Meta? Devices that are not as popular, let's say not Apple devices, not Samsung devices that are not as popular. How does that diverse range of devices gets covered?
Yeah, and by the way, I when I list things here, I don't just talk about Meta. I talk about, like, I work at Salesforce for several years and a couple other organizations before. Generally speaking, there are some, and I can't really name names and stuff, but there are some organizations, some companies that allow you to use them to then, like, you run one UI tests across a selection of devices of different OS, of different version of the phone. You know, it can be iPhone 1 through like 15 or whatever else, different browsers, different resolutions of the browsers. So you can go that route, and big companies definitely do that. Do that. Some, by having those, especially manual testing components, they would have physically those devices. They would have great amount of metrics. You don't want to just test everything. One thing I loved the most about Salesforce at one point was we deprecated support for IE11 early on. Like, at some point, you can't just do the full range. You have to know where your users are actually at. Because if you could just try to keep, like, supporting 5% of your users on some obscure Android version, you will take away resources of your development and testing team from focusing on the core use cases. So metrics is the key there, so you don't just split your focus everywhere. So heavy metrics first, and then you can use different organizations to help out, or do it yourself, but really know where to focus and what to prioritize.
Awesome. So any specific question, Dmitry, you find interesting that you want to pick?
Let me see. No, please pick any of the highly upvoted ones. I'm fine with those.
All right, so let me pick the latest question that we had.
How difficult is it to work autonomously at the team at Meta? Is there a lot of red tape to go through to get things done? Autonomously. I mean, it depends what you're referring to. So I keep looking here. What they actually all are there. It highly depends. What we mean by that. When you're never autonomous, you're always cross-functional. You always have multiple teams you work with. But everyone just wants to wants to deliver, wants to bring the best experience to their customer possible. Of course, if you more customer, like, client facing, and it deals with data, the rail guards, and I wouldn't call it red tape. It's a guardrails for a reason. That might slow things down, but again, you have plenty of things to work on. I've never had to sit idly because of some blocker or whatever. So it's actually exciting. It might sound silly sometimes. With big companies, they think it's like you small cog in a massive machine, but in reality, every organization I worked at, it would be a startup within a big organization. So you would have multiple startups working with each other. almost selling their services to other teams, working sometimes on the same thing. You would have horizontal mobility, changing teams. So it's, if you're not satisfied with one team, you have hundreds of other teams to join. So in that sense, it's never been an issue.
Awesome. So this is another culture-based question, I'll say. So we talked a lot about communication. We talked a lot about how it's important that the team get together. But what happens if there's, let's say, a situation related to conflict in the team? Your PM is not listening to you, or maybe some higher up is not on board with the idea that you have related to, let's say, optimization. How do you tackle that?
It depends, right? It's like, try to be objective. Let's take an ideal scenario and the worst case scenario. So I always give people benefit of the doubt. It's a good PM, just we're miscommunicating there. PM would generally be more right. I would hope to say it's because as a developer, you might be too down into the weeds of things, too deep down in like technical things, or has to be performant. But ideally, PM who is the one who actually talks to the customer, they represent the customer, they know the customer, and so they're able to say, they actually don't load this page that much, or when they do, they don't care, it takes forever. And so more often than not, they are right in that sense. At the same time, as always with people, they might not be right? They might think they know the customer, but in reality they don't, because it's also a skill and it also takes time. That takes context and domain knowledge. So in that case, again, it depends on a sort of a conflict you have. Sometimes you have to stand ground and say, we can't take this, what people call low-hanging fruit, over doing the testing. You have to push for, has to be high quality, has to be high bar, or you kind of compromise, saying, all right, we might do, because of the time crunch or whatever, you might need to deliver it quickly. I understand, maybe compliance, whatever else, like GDPR, for example, right? We have to implement it, but next cycle we'll do fewer feature work items, but we'll actually go back and do the code coverage that we promised to do. So in that case, you have to be, it's whoever you represent. If it's about quality of the product and developer side, you have to stay firm there. But the PM's role is to represent the customer best. And so that's where conflict can arise, which you have to be mindful of.
So ideal situation is release quality products at the pace PM wants, right? So
Yeah.
fast release cycles.
Yes.
Awesome. So there's another question. I think it's a mixture of, I'll say, history and how kind of Meta is also, or not just Meta, any of the companies that you have worked with is evolving and still saying agile, or still saying at a, let's say, fast release cycle pace.
I'm not going to talk about Meta in particular, because you'll get me all in trouble in here. But like, I wouldn't say, and every company is evolving one way or another. I don't think anyone will go to waterfall, if that's what we mean by agile. But if we talk about just agile as an adjective, I think we'll remain that, right? Because we have to be agile, we have to be flexible. We have to try out new tools. If anything else I see organizations do, that they try to minimize the spread of tools people use. Instead of having 20 tools, you have like 5, and you do it well. That's what people will do more and more at big organizations, I think. So that would be my quick answer.
So let's flip this a little bit, right? So I am a small company. We are planning to go to, let's say, have more customers, release new features, more features. What would you be your one advice to them to still keep maintaining a fast release cycle, but as one best practice they should stick to no matter how big they grow?
Interesting. That's a good question. It's not a good question, but I would think step back and think what you're doing. Try to dedicate some time into deleting code. I like to delete code. Delete all tests. Get rid of the ones that fail often, because you will blow up quickly. Think really it just comes from a point of understanding what you're doing with tests. UI tests, are you inclined to write too many of them? So if anything, I would say actually, yeah, that's actually probably a good thing. And the main thing, make sure your developers, especially newer ones who just joined, know exactly what your customers do, who your customers are, and so they can replicate those use cases when they test. So don't do the edge cases first, to actually do the core cases. It will help you to stay agile and move quickly.
Awesome. I think with that, we are at time. In fact, a minute over the time. But again, thanks, Dmitry, for taking the time out, walking us through these amazing insights. We had a really great Q&A session as well. Guys, we may not be able to, again, would not have not been able to pick up all the questions over here, but we have a thread at Lanmetis community going on where you can post those, and we'll try to answer the current questions over there as well. So feel free to drop there. Other people who are still asking, again, these sessions are recorded and we'll make them live at our YouTube channel as well at a later date. So please subscribe our YouTube channel as well. Again, Dmitry, thanks for the session. Really great insight.
Thank you. Thank you all. I'll see you.
Bye-bye. Everyone have a great day ahead.